most of the young adults at school never admit to another that they need help or that they feel suicidal, but there will be cues sometimes. What are some of the examples of that, and where would they display these cues?
Mm-hmm. So this is something that I try to teach others when I do public speaking, or when I even work with my clients, called psychoeducation. And that's when you teach people both in general about mental health problems and mental illnesses, as well as good mental health and positive practices in your mental health. So part of that is recognizing certain behaviors and certain things that people say that can be indicative of either end of the spectrum. So either if they're doing very well or if they're struggling. And then at the extreme end, if they are in fact suicidal. So starting at that extreme end, if somebody is suicidal, you might hear them, one of the things that people often overlook, for example, is that they may be making jokes or talking more about suicide than maybe they have in the past, or maybe more than is kind of socially acceptable within their friend group, or
more than what they usually do.
More than what they usually do, exactly, and more than what people around them usually do too. If it's a bit out of sync with their social circumstance, you hear this is a pretty common one actually. If people are kind of mentioning things like that, and connected to that, if they're talking about even themes around death, like when I'm gone, or you'll regret this, later, or suggestions of some sort of finality. Those can be warning signs. Sometimes they're not talking at all, especially if they're a young person. They might be drawing. This happens a lot. They may be doodling, or they may be, or if they're online and they're posting a lot of content, for example, on Facebook or Twitter or something, if somebody is always posting a lot of either concerning text statuses or links to things that are to do with suicide. And granted, I post a lot of things on Facebook and Twitter about suicide and mental health, but I do it from a different perspective. I do it from an education perspective, in terms of warning signs and things of that nature that people can look for. But if it's somebody who's not a mental health professional doing this kind of thing, then that can be concerning. If they're producing a lot of content, either online or in person, that seems to show a particular obsession or at least a preoccupation with suicide or with death in general. For example, if they tend to be posting pictures of cutting or of various other self-harming behaviors, that can be certainly a concern. If they give away personal belongings, prized belongings, things that normally they cherish, or if they, things that they hold special to themselves, that can certainly be a warning sign as well. And you see that a little more in people who are a bit older if they're giving things away. But it's not uncommon for young people to do it as well. Usually there are signs in the way people talk, but sometimes you have to look elsewhere. You have to look at the situation around them. So, for example, we know that there are risk factors if somebody has a diagnosed mental illness. 90% of people, up to 90% of people who die by suicide had a mental health problem or illness at the time of their death. Now, it may not have been diagnosed, but we know by research through what's called psychological autopsies, that is, somebody who dies by suicide, the researcher looks through their past health records, their health history, and their health circumstance, and they're able to conclude with that information, with a pretty high degree of certainty, that the person probably was struggling with a mental illness. So we know through that kind of research, through psychological autopsies, that up to 90% of people who die by suicide have had a mental health problem or illness.
And all the victims, both the teenagers, young adults, and even the older adults, they would always give a cue somewhere about them feeling suicidal before they actually would attempt suicide?
Yeah, that's my firmly held belief. That said, there's always exceptions, and it seems like almost always, or at least the majority of time, people often seem to say, I never saw it coming. Now that's difficult, because as a mental health professional, there's almost always some sort of sign. Whether or not we're able to see that sign, and sometimes it's because we're too close. Sometimes family members can't see the signs and symptoms of suicide because they love this person too much, and they're just not psychologically, and you can't blame them, psychologically they're not able to comprehend or be able to process signs that this person may be exhibiting.
It would be like a psychological bias towards the person?
Yeah, exactly. It very well could be. I'm of the view, though, that there is almost always some sort of warning sign. Sometimes it's very subtle, but there's almost always a warning sign.